in this workshop we'll be looking at, with the eyes of an experimental psychologist, some of the first psychologies we have, at least we have a record of, in other words, theories of how the mind works and how we could use that information in order to flourish. So your task was to come up with some claim made by Gautama, the Buddha, or by the Stoics, and then think of a way in which it could be rephrased or interpreted to make it testable, and then consider the evidence for the claim. Now, in making that interpretation, you will simplify or transform or change the claim in some way, but try to stay as close to a legitimate reading of the claim as you can. I mean, there's no one legitimate reading of Buddhism or Stoicism. There's many Buddhisms and many Stoicisms. But there will be some ways of interpreting claims that seem fairly true to at least one way of thinking about it, and making it testable at the same time. Now, there might be some evidence relevant to that claim that's already out there which you can review, or you might have to think of new sorts of evidence that you'd need to collect in order to test it. Now, one of you brought up the claim of Seneca, the Stoic claim, that adversity can be good for you, that adversity can help you flourish. So how could we test that claim? I mean, there are people who say because of the tough life they've grown from that, but maybe those people would have done well in all sorts of conditions. Who knows why they really did well? So what we need is some way of collecting evidence for the claim that adversity can be good for you. So you might come up with an intervention in which you tell people, now for the next 4 weeks what I want you to do is to seek out difficult situations, seek out people who disagree with you, maybe fast for a bit, don't eat food, sleep on a rough floor. This is exactly what Seneca did. He was amazingly rich, but nonetheless, he says he made sure he regularly experienced hardship deliberately, sleeping on hard surfaces, cold baths, not eating much food, and so on, just to create a certain amount of adversity. Now, if you came up with some intervention like that in which people were put through boot camp, some tough experiences, and then you had a pre-test and a post-test on some measure you'd also come up with and argued was a good way of measuring happiness or flourishing in some way, that still wouldn't constitute good evidence for the claim that adversity is good for you, because we would need a control group. Now, one control you might consider is a no intervention control. You assign a group of people to an intervention and randomly assign another set of people to no intervention, and that would be useful, and that's something that's often done in intervention studies, but it still wouldn't be good enough, because one group had an intervention and another group did nothing, and that can create different expectations, beliefs, and demand characteristics. So in thinking about testing some claim, especially if you have an intervention, what you need is what's called an active control group. In other words, another intervention to contrast with the one that should work, but one that shouldn't work according to the theory. And ideally, you would make sure that the active control was just as plausible to people if you measured their expectations and beliefs about whether the intervention would affect the variable that you're measuring. So in an adversity intervention, you could have a contrast intervention, a mollycoddling intervention, where you say to people, make sure you don't stress yourself. You know, stress is very bad, so don't talk to people who you disagree with. Don't put yourself in difficult situations. Make sure you only go places where you know it's calm, and you'll never be in any trouble, and so on. So then you could have your adversity intervention, your mollycoddling intervention, and your untreated control. Or another claim that one of you brought up that would be interesting to test is a procedure that Epictetus recommends, and Marcus Aurelius, which is to just describe events factually as they actually are. So if you break a mug, you would say, I broke a mug. The mug was green, it's now in pieces. They're just facts. And what you'd avoid are the value judgments, the evaluations, like that mug meant everything to me, and so on. So you just stick to what's factually true, and you analyze the event, break it down to its components, and describe those facts. Now this is actually, you can find the same manipulation in, say, acceptance and commitment therapy. And the question is this useful? Would this, say, make people less distressed? Well, you would need to come up with an intervention. Say you could put people through some difficult experience and ask them to deal with it by making factual statements, factual descriptions of what's happening. But again, if that was all that you did, you wouldn't know whether any benefit that came from it was because of the theory that looking at things as they are and avoiding misleading value judgments was important. So you could have another condition where people have to evaluate the events that are happening and talk about what those events meant specifically for themselves. So again, you need some sort of active control, some sort of contrast which is theoretically relevant in order to acquire the sort of evidence that we need about whether the claim has some truth. All right, now let's move on to what I'm going to go through is some specific ideas that you could focus on. And this is just a whole bunch of ideas. You don't have to choose any of these, but I'll go through these ideas because what I list here as well is specific quotes from the Buddhist and Stoic literature that you therefore have readily available and you don't have to spend your time searching for. Now, both Stoicism and Buddhism agree that certain sorts of emotions would be eliminated in the ideal state when the person achieves nirvana, becomes a sage, in other words, is flourishing. So the sins of anger, pride, and so on, or other negative emotions like grief and anxiety. Now, on the one hand, people often agree that these emotions can be bad and they would like to, reduce them, if not get rid of them. But on the other hand, they evolved, and they evolved because they serve some function. So they are there for a reason. Of course, evolution's reason is by having these emotions, more of your genes got put in, more of your ancestors' genes got put into the next generation, and that's not a reason you need to buy into. I mean, cruelty, rape, pillage, jealousy, murder, and so on evolved as tendencies in people, but that doesn't mean we have to accept them as part of our flourishing or buy into evolution's game. Nonetheless, it is worth considering why emotions might have evolved in order to consider carefully whether we really would want to eliminate or even reduce them. So, for example, this book here is a good collection of essays on the function of different negative emotions. from an evolutionary perspective. Well, the argument comes from an evolutionary perspective, and then evidence is collected to say, actually, they can be useful in some ways. For example, some degree of negative emotion makes you less susceptible to misleading information, less gullible, more capable of detecting deception. It can make you more fair in games of sharing. And anxiety is there for a reason, because it makes you think about things that might be important to some upcoming task. If you've got an exam coming up and it keeps popping into your mind, well, what if this is on the exam? Well, that could motivate you to go and look it up. Or if you're going to give a talk and you think, but what if they ask this? Well, that could motivate you to consider the arguments and thereby make the talk better, prepare you better for the exam, and so on. And indeed, there is some evidence that students who are anxious do better in exams later. So, is that good enough for you? That's, I think, an open question. It's not something with an absolute answer. These are issues which the Stoics did consider. For example, Aristotle had pointed out the benefit of some degree of these negative emotions, and that anger was motivating. For example, anger can motivate you to rectify injustice. That is, you could say, the function of anger. Someone's committed an injustice, and when you show anger, you are making a display, communicating to the other person that you recognize it's an injustice, you will not put up with it, and you have some power to do something about it. And you're in a motivational position to actually do it. Well, Seneca responded to this point and said, is justice really going to be done in the best way if you're acting out of anger and a desire for revenge rather than a desire for justice? So just because emotions like anger do motivate you in certain ways and do achieve certain goals, it doesn't mean that it could be the only way of achieving those goals. For example, you might be less susceptible to prejudice and stereotypes when you're in a negative mood, but maybe if you practice mindfulness, you'd also be less susceptible to prejudice and stereotypes. I don't know. So I leave this as an open question. The extent to which at least some degree of negative emotion could be a positive thing that contributes to our flourishing, or should we, in fact, eliminate the passions, as the Stoics argued? Now, both Stoicism and Buddhism emphasized moderation, self-control, and willpower in an uncompromising way. You should, as the Buddhist texts say, guard the senses constantly mindful. In other words, constantly self-controlled. Now, in some ways, this does fit in with psychological research. For example, most of you probably know about the marshmallow test, where Walter Mischel in the 60s asked children to sit in front of a marshmallow for a certain number of minutes and said, if that's still there when I come back in say 5 minutes, you'll get another one. Now, the point of the study at the time was just to look at the strategies children might have for dealing with temptation and inhibition and self-control. But when these children were chased up decades later, those children who lasted the time and got the second marshmallow, they turned out to have better grades at school, earned higher incomes, less trouble with the law, and so on. In other words, the self-control that they showed when young children seemed to carry over to a better, more flourishing life later. But is this all there is to flourishing? because it seems that a big part of the way people enjoy themselves is precisely to give up self-control, to get drunk, laugh, dance, give in to passion. Does the flourishing life for you mean giving up all of those things and having complete self-control at every moment? So that's another issue to consider, the extent to which unremitting self-control is really part of the flourishing life for human beings. Might indeed lead to more stress and ill health because of that. And there's some evidence that it can do so in certain circumstances. Do we need to let go and give up self-control sometimes? I'll leave that as an open question. Now, another direction you might like to go in to consider the notion of flourishing presented by the Stoics and the Buddhists is to look at positive psychology. And I put this book here by Martin Seligman as an entry into that. For example, people in positive psychology emphasize the value of positive social relationships and social support in flourishing. And so far that's fine, and consistent with Stoicism and Buddhism at one level, but I just want to consider it in a bit more detail. An example of an exercise used in positive psychology is expressing gratitude to people. You could think about a person that has done something good to you and you actually feel quite grateful to. Write up a description of what they did, what it meant to you, and how you feel about it, and go and read it to them. And apparently if you do this can make you feel very good for some time. Now, Buddhism and Stoicism both explicitly endorse the value of friendships and being part of a group and being part of a community. Community was a big part of both of them. The monks live in a community of monks, and in meditation you'd have a special friend who would guide you through what you need to do, a mentor basically, to let you know what you need to do to get through sticky patches, what next meditation practice to take you to the next level, and so on. And indeed, Buddhism has been quite communal from the very start. For example, the great councils, several hundred years BC, to decide what would constitute the canon of Buddhism. It was a communal decision in that sense. And you might remember from the first lecture these circles developed within Stoicism, where you have a natural concern for yourself, and then immediate family, and so on, and out to the neighborhood, community, and mankind generally. But generally there's diminishing concern as you go out in these circles. So what you try and do is pull the circles in, or if you like, move your circle of concern outwards until you become equally concerned for all of mankind. And very similarly, from a Buddhist perspective, you practice feeling friendliness, concern, compassion, happiness in the happiness of others, loving kindness for people, all mankind, indeed all sentient beings, until you have again spread those positive pro-social feelings out to all sentient beings. So that clearly shows a concern with positive social relationships. But what I'm concerned about is the extent to which, when that becomes universalized, you lose a particular attachment with particular people. So, for example, what role does family or children or a romantic partner play in this? You wouldn't, in the end of this, when you've achieved the end, you wouldn't have a particular attachment towards your own children or towards your romantic partner. So my question is that part of your notion of flourishing? for you to flourish, would you have a particularly strong relationship with your own children and a particular romantic partner, or is flourishing consistent with an equal feeling spread out amongst everyone? And also consider that when you've achieved the goal of either Stoicism or Buddhism, there is a calm inner joy that persists all the time, that is not contingent on other people. So if you were brutally raped and told your partner that, and your partner was a sage or achieved nirvana, they would have a calm inner joy, and as they heard what you were talking about, is that consistent with flourishing and your notion of the ideal partner? Now, another set of issues to think about, the evidential base for, is the effects of meditation and mindfulness, and this is a huge literature. In fact, probably the most common way of answering the essay question is to consider this literature. Now, just as I was talking about at the very beginning with evidence, what's crucial is considering the evidence. So if you review the evidence for mindfulness, don't just uncritically accept what's said in abstracts or reviews and report that in your essay. This was the most common failing of essays in previous years, is the uncritical acceptance of evidence. So what you have to do is consider the strength of the evidence for the claims that mindfulness does help people in positive ways. So, was there an active control group? Was there a control group at all? In the active control group, were expectations controlled so that it actually had equal plausibility as the intervention itself? So make sure you're critical about evidence in evaluating it. And consider whether the measures used measured what we would be interested in without too much effect of demand characteristics. So my subjects have known what it was that you're trying to test, and then essentially given you what you want because they thought they were being good subjects in doing that. Now, in some ways, you might think the opposite of mindfulness is mind wandering or daydreaming. Sometimes it is. Just bear in mind that being mindful means that you're locating whatever mental states are happening, you're recognizing that as mental states happening in the present moment, and you're regarding that with some calmness, if not joy. And that is perfectly consistent with planning and fantasizing. As long as you knew you're planning and fantasizing and you were doing that as part of the task you had set yourself, then indeed you could do it mindfully. Because a lot of daydreaming and fantasizing and so on is not mindful. You're meant to be doing something else. You get drawn into the daydream and you don't know what it is that you're doing. Now, it turns out in surveys that about 50% of our waking time is spent daydreaming. So if it was so bad for us, why is 50% of our time spent doing it? It must be useful at least from an evolutionary perspective, whether or not we want to buy into evolution's game. And I've put a link here to an article that indeed argues that daydreaming can be useful in planning creativity and sometimes creating just positive feelings. But now, why is this? Why should it be mindless in the way we do? Is it really useful to do this mindlessly? Well, I got some inspiration from Robert Wright's Coursera course on Buddhism and psychology, which I sent you the link to. He draws on evolutionary psychology, some work of Kurzban, thinking about the mind as modular. So if you think of there not being a self, which is a Buddhist notion, there's no self there, there's a bunch of modules which are in essence competing to control the organism or your activities. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, it could well be the case that often just because a person, a creature, has set themselves a task and is focused on a particular task, it doesn't mean that they should keep focusing on that task indefinitely or for the period of time that they set themselves. Life is full of all sorts of things that come up. It's complex. And so the way you might design a system optimally is to have the modules constantly vying for attention, for control of resources or activities that's going on. So it might be a natural tendency of modules to keep, as it were, posting their messages or saying, look at this, think about this, no, think about this, no, think about this. Especially if you focused on one module for one particular period of time, who knows what's happening in the world, who knows what's coming up in life. Just as I was talking about with anxiety, you might have some task coming up that you have to do, and if you're completely focused on something else, you might let slip certain things. So if the modules keep pushing and vying for attention, you go, oh yeah, there was this task, I need to think about that, what's the answer to that? And that indeed could be very useful. So this made sense of me, this type of architectural notion made sense of me why we might daydream so much. It's the constant competition amongst the modules. And indeed, when I thought about it that way, it even helped my breath meditation, my concentration on my breath, because until I'd thought of that, these thoughts would pop into my head, and the thoughts would seem very important. Well, of course I must think about this now. But when you actually think about it, why do I need to think about anything else for the next 20 minutes? The thought coming into my head and saying I'm important, that's just part of the modular architecture. That's just the module's natural tendency to want to assert themselves, to make sure you're not missing out on anything. And once I realized that, I found it was sort of like a step upwards. I found it easier to say, I ignore those thoughts, well, I let them pass, and then to keep concentrating on the breath. Well, now let's go through some other issues where the Buddhists and the Stoics sometimes agree and sometimes disagree that I think are interesting and open and worth exploring in terms of what it is for humans to flourish. So the Stoics in particular emphasize reducing one's expectations, thinking about all the negative things that were going to happen, including the extremely negative things like maybe your child might die that day, maybe you lose your legs, maybe you'll die that day. And everything else as well, all the bad people you're going to meet, the grumpy people, the people who are going to get in your way. Now, this advice to rehearse this and think about the negative events that are bound to come up goes against decades of a sort of self-help book, positive thinking, telling you to think positively all the time. So, which is right? Now, I should say here that what you're doing when you're being a Stoic and considering these negative things, you're not catastrophizing, you're not going, these bad things are going to happen, it's going to be terrible. Quite the opposite. What you're doing is rehearsing how you'll deal with them. You know bad stuff's going to happen, that's just the way of life, and you imagine it happening, but with you being calm, tranquil, and dealing it in a happy way. In any case, I leave that as an open question as to whether this is a useful procedure to engage in. Now, the Stoics urged one to accept determinism. In other words, every event that happens in the world and to you in the tiniest detail was completely determined from the beginning of time. In other words, there were causal pathways that led to precisely whatever is happening to happen. And what you should do is accept this and to will things to happen as nature wants them, as fate is going to guide them. So there's a literature on this already in psychology, with some people arguing that if you get people to believe more in determinism, that perhaps it's a bad thing. It can make them cheat more and perhaps try less hard at things. But the existing literature entails a bit of a confusion in that the Stoics believed in determinism, but not that this should lead to apathy, or that this in any way takes away your responsibility for acting with effort to achieve your goals. So they were what we call compatibilists between determinism and free will. In other words, you do have a free will, but there's also determinism, and this is a legitimate and maybe even a majority position amongst current day philosophers. The Stoics were the first to present the compatibilist position. So Chrysippus, the intellectual powerhouse of Stoicism, explicitly argued that although certain things are fated, you will achieve them. It's also fated you will achieve them by your hard work. If you get better from your illness, that might be because you have to call up the doctor and put some effort into it in order to get better, but all of that is fated. So you working hard, you making decisions, you resolving to do things is also part of nature. Now, Buddhism, by the way, didn't have a particular position on this. There is the notion of dependent origination, where mental states cause other mental states. Did that really mean complete determinism in every way? Well, it's not clear. Gautama didn't make that argument. He did argue against fatalism in the sense of give up what you're doing. Fatalism meaning give up what you're doing because it's going to happen anyway. He certainly argued against that, but his position on determinism is less clear. Now, both Buddha and the Stoics argued you should have an attitude of indifference to pleasure, because pleasure is not good in itself. The opposite of this would be the Epicureans, who argued focus on pleasure because pleasure is what makes life good. And indeed, if you didn't think about pleasures, future pleasures, past pleasures, and enjoy the pleasures you're having now, well, you'd become rather depressed and upset. So incidentally, Epicurus argued he was a hedonist, he argued for pleasure, but he thought the way to get most pleasure was through some moderation. It's when you're really hungry that freshly baked bread tastes so exquisitely beautiful, and that's as good a pleasure as you could get from any food. And when you're really thirsty, that water is as good a pleasure as you could get from any drink. But Epicurus argued for some moderation, some adversity, in order to get the most pleasure, whereas for the Stoics and Buddha, you would have an indifference to pleasure, and moderation, and some adversity, not in order to create pleasure, but precisely because pleasure is not important, and to teach yourself that. So the question is, who is right about this? Does creating an attitude of an indifference to pleasure really lead to flourishing? I'll leave that as an open question for you to explore. Now, both Stoicism and Buddhism advise regularly reflecting on death, thinking about your own death, those of others, and in Buddhism there's a series of meditations on decaying corpses. You can meditate on actual corpses, imagined corpses, or indeed your own imagined decaying body in the future. Now, it's recognized that this doesn't always lead to immediate happiness and flourishing. In one of the suttas, it's described how some monks committed suicide after these meditations, so Gautama brought them quickly back to breath meditation. But nonetheless, it's regarded there's a place for this at the right time, the right place. That meditation on death can be helpful. Well, it can teach a number of things. One is to look at your own body in a more impersonal way, so you see that it's your body, your health, your legs, your arms, and so on are not essential to your flourishing. But also, meditation on death can give you a sense of urgency and involvement in the moment. And indeed, people who've had near-death experiences or have almost died often say it was the greatest thing that ever happened to them. So that sort of growth experience from confronting death can certainly happen, and it's an interesting question about whether explicit, deliberate meditations on death, as recommended by Stoicism and Buddhism, is helpful, or the conditions under which it's helpful, and there is a psychological literature on that. Now, a particular Buddhist concern, not a Stoic concern, is to accept that there is no permanent self. There is no identical essence that continues from moment to moment that makes you the self you are. There's just a succession of mental states causing other mental states. And it can be useful conventionally to refer to that as a self, but there is, in fact, metaphysically underneath it all, no absolute self. Now, opposing Indian tradition is to say that there is a permanent self, and in fact the goal of meditation is to realize that and to see that, whereas the goal of Buddhist meditation is to achieve the opposite, to see that there is no self. So which philosophy leads to most flourishing? David Hume came up with some very Buddhist-like arguments about why there was no self, and that made him feel depressed. Now, in fact, it's interesting that he may just have been influenced by Buddhism, as Hume did talk to a missionary who'd been to Tibet and had studied Tibetan Buddhism, so the arguments might have come to the Western tradition through Hume, actually originally from Buddhism. On the other hand, as I mentioned in the lecture, Derek Parfit came up with arguments for there not being any self above and beyond the causal connections between mental states, and that he found that liberating and happy, made him happy. So the conditions under which cultivating a sense of self or no self might lead to flourishing or happiness is an interesting question that I leave you to consider. Now, the next topic in which Stoics and the Buddhists seem to disagree is on compassion. The Stoics thought compassion or pity was an emotion to be eradicated because it meant buying into false beliefs about the importance of externals. So, for example, if a Roman noble had ordered a shipment of peacock tongues for his dinner party, and the shipment didn't arrive in time, and this was such an utter disaster for him that he was weeping on the floor, should you feel pity or compassion for him? Well, from the Stoic point of view, Epictetus says you might make a sort of an outward show of a bit of compassion, but in fact you don't feel it, because you know this is what happens when you believe your flourishing is predicated on peacock tongues. Just look at the result. Weeping on the floor, and that is a false belief and ultimately just needs to be eradicated. On the other hand, Buddhism taught compassion as a major component of flourishing and of the meditative exercises that it engages in, and there seems to be a direct contradiction here. So does cultivating compassion help flourishing, or rather potentiate one's general tendency to have negative emotions? Well, I should say here that the conflict there is a tension here, but it's a little bit more on the surface than you might first think, because in fact the Buddhist agrees with the Stoics that the ultimate source of the the Roman nobles or the other people suffering, is an incorrect view of the world. And what you actually need to do, what the sort of action that your compassion should motivate, is making people more sage-like, coming to see their incorrect views as incorrect, and moving closer to proper flourishing. Now, we've talked about different emotions and the Buddhist and Stoic attitude towards them. One interesting one is shame, because this is a little bit different from the others, in that, from a Stoic point of view, until you've achieved being a sage, you are correct in your judgment that you yourself are flawed. And the judgment that you are flawed is the emotion of shame. So in that sense, shame for Stoic is not a passion or an incorrect emotion until you've become a sage. It's actually a correct judgment. And you see in Buddhism the use of shame in teaching, as you see it in Epictetus as a Stoic, teaching people by shaming them. From a modern point of view, this seems strange. Pedagogically, if I was to shame one of you, would you regard that as good practice? And indeed, probably fairly standard psychology views distinguish shame and guilt, as is done in this Tang the Endearing book here, and to say guilt is the emotion where you say an action you've done is wrong, where shame is the emotion where you say you are wrong, you are at fault. And they argue that shame has all sorts of negative consequences, whereas guilt has positive consequences, namely in motivating making amends. Whereas we see there's in one of the Pali Sutras I've listed here is a distinct use of shame. It's not just, we're not just talking about the way we translate terms, but Buddha attacks the person himself for having an incorrect view, shames that person, and the description of the person's body language is the withdrawal that comes with shame. But I'd just like to say at this point that there is a counter-argument, and maybe there is something to the Stoic and Buddhist approach. So in this paper I've linked to here by some Sussex psychologists, Viv Vignoles and Rupert Brown, as well as Colin Leach, who was at Sussex, they argue that shame, under some conditions and sometimes, can actually have pro-social consequences. In other words, finding fault in yourself can lead you to make reparations and actions that remedy the situation, which was indeed the motivation of the Stoics and the Buddhists in eliciting shame. All right, so those are a set of issues which I regard as genuinely open, and I hope you'll explore and consider critically the evidence for either reviewing any existing evidence or in coming up with your own evidence to evaluate the basis for those different claims.